Hello everyone, I'm back with another video. I'm super excited about today's session because we are diving into something that's not just cool but absolutely essential if you are building modern web applications. Now, if you have been following my channel for a while, you know I love breaking down complex topics into simple actionable steps, and this video is going to no different. We are gonna take a deep dive into identity, which is basically your one-stop shop for managing users in your app, whether it's handling logins, registration, password resets, or securing APIs. Identity is not just a feature, it's the backbone of any application where you need to know who your users are and what they are allowed to do. Think about it whether you are building a social media app, an e-commerce site, or even just a personal blog. You need to manage users securely and efficiently. .NET makes this easier than ever with built-in support for all the heavy lifting like handling passwords securely, managing roles, and even generating JSON tokens for API authentication. And with .NET 8, the whole process has been streamlined. You get all the power of identity with less setup, more flexibility, and better performance. Plus, when we tie this all together with Swagger, you will see how easy it is to actually test and manage your APIs in a real-world scenario. Alright, before we dive into nitty-gritty, let's talk about the version of the project we are using today. Everything we are doing today is on .NET 8, and let me tell you, it makes the whole process of setting up identity, migrations, and Swagger a breeze. Plus, you get all the latest performance improvements, so your app isn't just functional, it's blazing fast. Now, before we get into the fun stuff, we need to make sure we have all the right packages installed. I'm gonna list them out and we will add them one by one. Entity Framework Core and SQL Server Provider. This is for working with your database. Entity Framework Core Tools. This allows us to use the .NET EF commands to create migrations. ASP.NET Core Identity Entity Framework. This one's crucial for integrating identity with Entity Framework Core. Swagger for API documentation. And of course, we need Swagger to document and test our APIs. With those packages installed, we are ready to start configuring identity and getting everything wired up. Alright folks, now we are getting into the heart of the project, setting up identity and the database. This is where we lay down the foundation for everything else, so let's make sure we get it right. I'm gonna break it down step by step, starting with creation of our application DB context class, setting up our connection string, and then writing it all up in program.cs. First up, let's create a new class called application DB context. This class is going to be the bridge between our application and the database, managing all the identity-related tables and more. Create a new folder in your project's root directory and call it data. This just helps keep things organized. Right-click on the data folder, select Add, Class, and name it application.dbcontext.cs. Now let's add some code to this class. What we are doing here is inheriting from identity DB context with the identity user as a generic class, which means this class will handle everything related to identity, like users, roles, and claims. If you need to add other models to your app, you define them here with dbset. Next, let's tell our application where to find the database by adding a connection string. This is like giving your app the address of the database server it needs to talk to. Open up app settings.json in the root of your project. You will see a JSON file with some configurations. We are going to add our connection string to it. Add the following code inside the connection string section. Now our app knows where to find the database, but we still need to register everything in the program.cs file. Alright, the final step here is to hook everything up in program.cs. This is where we register our application DB context with the dependency injection system and configure identity, and also we are gonna register Swagger for documentation. Builder.service.add.authentication registers the authentication services with default settings. We are setting up our app to know that users will need to authenticate to access certain parts of it. Add bearer token. Here we are adding bearer token authentication. Bearer tokens are the tokens typically used in APIs, where each request to the server includes a token that proves the client's identity. This is essential for securing API endpoints. Builder.services.add authorization builder sets up the authorization services. It's like telling the app, I want to protect certain resources and make sure only authorized users can access them. Builder.services.add DB context. This registers our application DB context, which is the class that manages our database connections. We are saying this is the database we will be using for identity. Options.use SQL Server specifies that we are using SQL Server as our database. This could be swapped out for something else like PostgreSQL or SQLite depending on your setup. Builder.services.add identity core. This setups identity using the basic identity user class, which represents a user in the system. If you have custom user model, you'd replace identity user with your own class. Identity framework stores. We are linking identity to our application DB context, meaning all the user data like usernames, passwords, and roles will be stored in our SQL Server database. Add API endpoints. This is a really handy method that automatically set up all the default identity API endpoints, like registration, login, and password management. No need to write all the boilerplate code yourself, it's all done for you. Now that we have got identity set up, let's move on to Swagger. Swagger is a fantastic tool for generating interactive API documentation. It lets you see all your endpoints in a web interface and even test them out right from your browser. Builder.services.add endpoints API Explorer. This is a simple method that adds support for discovering API endpoints, which Swagger needs to generate the documentation. Builder.services.add Swagger gen. This method registers Swagger with our app. It's like saying, okay, let's generate some documentation for all our APIs. Add security definition. We add security definitions here to let Swagger know that our API endpoints require JWT tokens. This is crucial if you are working with secure APIs. Add security requirement. This enforces that every request made to be a secure endpoint in Swagger must include a valid JWT token. Without this, you wouldn't be able to test protected endpoints from within the Swagger UI. Alright, now that we have set everything up, we need to make sure Swagger and our identity APIs are actually available when we run the application. App.environment.isDevelopment. This makes sure that Swagger is only enabled in development environments. You typically don't want your API documentation exposed in production for security reasons. App.useSwagger. This method tells the app to generate the Swagger JSON file, which contains all the API metadata. App.useSwagger UI. This sets up the interactive Swagger UI, so you can view and test your API endpoints right in the browser. App.mapIdentity API. This line maps all the identity API endpoints to your app's routing. It's like flipping the switch that makes all those default identity endpoints like login, register available in your API. So after setting up identity and configuring Swagger, the next step is to create a migration. This migration will take the current state of your code, specifically your DB context and any models, and translate that into SQL commands that will create or modify the necessary database tables. In Visual Studio, open the Package Manager console from Tools. NuGet Package Manager console. Type add-migration and give it a name such as initial create. This command generates a migration script. The initial create is just a name for the migration. It can be anything that makes sense to you, like create identity schema or set up users tables. This migration will create the tables required by identity like ASP.NET users, ASP.NET roles, etc. After creating the migration, you need to apply it to the database. This step actually runs the SQL commands generated by the migration, creating or modifying the necessary tables in your database. In the Package Manager console, type update-database. After running this command, you should check your database to ensure everything is set up correctly. If you are using SQL Server, you can open SQL Server Management Studio or any other database management tool. So I'm gonna test out the identity setup we have built using Swagger to make sure everything is working perfectly. I'm gonna do three key things: register a new user, log in to get a JW token, and then use that token to access protected API endpoint. So let's dive right in. Before we start testing, we need to make sure that our weather forecast controller is protected, meaning only authenticated user can access it. To do this, we will use authorized attribute. This attribute tells ASP.NET Core that this controller should only be accessible to authenticated users. So if you are not logged in with a valid token, you are not getting access to this weather data. Now that we've protected our weather forecast API, let's move on to testing everything out in Swagger. Alright, run the application. Let's get a new user registered so we can start playing around with our API. Look for the post register endpoint. Click on the Try It Out button next to the register endpoint. Enter the registration details in the body. Here's an example. Click the Execute button. If everything is set up correctly, you should see a 200 OK response, meaning our user has been successfully registered. Their information is now safely stored in the database. Now we've got our user registered, it's time to log in and get that all-important JW token, which we will use to authenticate our requests. Scroll down in the Swagger UI and find the login endpoint. Enter the login details in the body. If you've logged in successfully, you should see a 200 OK response with a token field in the JSON response. This token is what we will use to access our protected weather forecast API. The JW token is your golden ticket to accessing protected resources in the app. Think of it as a VIP pass. You show this token to the API and if it's valid, you get in. Now let's put that JW token to good use by accessing the protected weather forecast endpoint. Scroll down to the Get Weather Forecast endpoint in the Swagger UI. Click the Authorized button at the top right corner of the Swagger UI. In the pop-up window, paste the JW token. Click Authorize and then close the authorization window. Now Swagger is set up to include your JW token in all requests to protected endpoints. Click on the Try It Out button next to the Get Weather Forecast endpoint. Click Execute. If everything is working correctly, you should see a 200 OK response with a list of weather forecasts. This means you have successfully authenticated and accessed a protected API endpoint using your JW token. Alright folks, that's a wrap on today's deep dive into identity in .NET 8. We have covered a ton of ground, from setting up your database with migrations, configuring identity, and integrating it all with Swagger for a smooth API testing. And if you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, don't forget to smash that like button. It really helps the channel out. Also make sure to subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss out on more awesome tutorials and coding tips coming your way. Trust me, we have got some exciting stuff lined up that you won't want to miss. Got questions, comments, or just want to say hi? Drop a comment below. I read every single one and I'm always here to help you out. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Keep coding, stay curious, and I will see you in the next video.